is everybody? I trust you're all well. We have a couple back with us that hadn't been here for a while. We're glad to see you. Kids, I want you to answer a question for me. Just one question, not too hard. Where are we going to start? Max, I'm going to start with you. Max, what are you going to be when you grow up? You don't know? You don't have any idea? What would you like to be? An engineer. Okay. You mean like that pulls the whistle on the train, or some other kind of engineer? Some other kind, I bet. Brianna? A doctor. Grant? What are you going to be when you grow up? A cowboy. Good, honest work. Be a lot of fun. A pediatrician. Not just a doctor, a pediatrician. Okay. Doctor. What kind of doctor? Brain surgeon? No, you don't know yet. Okay. Isaac? Excuse me, Nathan. You're Nathan. Isaac's not here today. Go ahead, Nathan. A worker, landscaper, okay. All right, Isaac, what are you going to be when you grow up? I couldn't hear you. I'm old. A policeman. Okay, Fabian, what about you? You are going to grow up, right? What are you going to do for a living? What did he say? An artist. Well, that's good. Jason, what are you going to be when you grow up? Teacher. Raymond? What? Well, what would you like to be? A movie star. How about that? Not that. Evan? Evan, you're spending a fortune every year to go to school to learn to be something. Elena? Oh, my goodness. Jonathan? Architect. Okay. Nathan? Ethan. I got a lot of grandkids. Ethan. Some aspiration. Okay. Well, we'll see how that all turns out for all of you. You know, there are a number of things I want to tell you about this. I got to thinking about it. I was going to preach about one job or another job, but it sort of amazed me. The number of things, number of lessons that the Lord drew from working men. What? Military. Okay, going in the military. There are a number of things the Lord drew, lessons that he drew from working. You know, as I think about that, I think that's so contrary to the thought that so many people have. They seem to compartmentalize their lives. And somehow their working has nothing to do with the rest of their life. But the Lord knew that wasn't true. The Lord knew that there were lessons to be drawn from our work, important lessons that we need to realize, many of them spiritual, some of them just practical. And he draws those lessons for us. He used illustration after illustration of working men. I think he wanted us to know that labor is its own reward. And you need to, as you work, you need to see the lessons that you can learn from working. Notice, he used fishermen and used them in his illustrations. He used the builders in his illustrations. We would call some of the people he dealt with project managers these days, or soldiers, or farmers, or accountants, or business managers, or employees, or employers. Human resource managers, we call them nowadays. Boy, that's a fancy thing. Somebody had to work hard to find that. Investors, he used investors. He's used real estate managers. He used landlords. He used renters. He used retailers. And all of these he drew lessons from for our lives. And you can draw lessons from your work too. You think it's just a job, but the Lord wanted you to learn lessons from those jobs. The first lesson he wants you to learn is, if you don't work, you don't eat. It's kind of a simple lesson. 2 Thessalonians, the 3rd chapter, yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we behave not ourselves disorderly among you. Paul's talking about his work as a preacher among the Thessalonians. And he says, I wasn't disorderly. Neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Paul worked a job while he was there. He wasn't just a preacher lollygagging around making money off of the brethren. That's what he says. There were other reasons for his doing that, but he doesn't go into all of them right now. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow us. And what was the example? For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. Now, you know, that's sort of contrary to the notion of things these days, where there's a lot of folks out there that think the goal of life is not working. The Lord thought you need to work to eat. He says, for we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly. Now, he just got through telling us he wasn't disorderly when he was with them, but there's some there that are disorderly. How are they disorderly? They are yelling and hollering through the streets? No, they are working not at all, but are busybodies. Them that are such we command and exhort by our Lord Jesus Christ, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. Now notice that. Eat your own bread. Don't be borrowing it from somebody else. Don't be expecting other people to give it to you, for you're not doing anything. You need to work. That's an important lesson. There's a lesson in working that the Lord has for you to learn. You know, you see all these folks out on the street corners begging money. Many times I've stopped and asked them and said, look, I got a job for you. Show up at 8 o'clock and give them the address. I'll pay you X number of dollars an hour. You won't have to sit out here begging. Well, how much does he pay? And I tell them, say, oh, no, I can make $15, $20 an hour here. $15 or $20 an hour out here begging or better. So you got to pay me more than that. But what are you? You're a beggar. You're a beggar. You don't work at all. You're disorderly. You haven't learned any lessons from working. You think the goal is for other people to give it to you instead of you actually working for it and eating your own bread, not something else somebody handed to you. But in addition, somebody asked me the other day to talk about fishing. Well, these guys are fishing. They are straining mightily, pulling that big net in. So that one of the things you can realize in life is that laziness, and if you've ever worked a job, there were some people working around you that you recognized pretty quickly and easily they're lazy. They're not pulling their weight. They're not holding their end of the bargain up. Laziness is obvious and has consequences. Now, let me tell you this. This applies to school too. So some of you youngsters that are in school that think the whole goal of life is going to recess and having a big party, you better rethink that. Laziness is obvious, probably in those lousy grades you're getting, and has consequences for your life. You need to realize it. Look at Proverbs 24. I went by the field of the slothful. Oh, you love to play on your phone. I forgot that. That's your job, playing Minecraft. Oh, I didn't realize that. Is there a lot of money in that these days? Maybe if you get to where you can program that, maybe so, but otherwise, you're just frittering away your time. You mean the goal of life is not watching TV shows constantly? Oh my, surprise, surprise. I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. And lo, it was all grown over with thorns, and nettles had covered the face thereof, and the stone wall thereof was broken down. You know what? You can drive through any neighborhood you care to name. Drive back through Eagledale here, and you'll find out who the lazy people are. Won't take you long. Won't take you long at all. Just look at their house. Look at their yard. And you'll realize what's going on. Here's a man who's too lazy to paint his house, to put it in good repair, to mow his yard, or he's dead inside there, one or the other. Yet a little sleep, I considered it well. I looked upon it and received instruction. Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall thy poverty come as one that traveleth, and thy want as an armed man. It's just like you got held up. Notice in Proverbs 6 and verse 6, you know, you can learn a whole lot just looking around. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Get a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall thy poverty come as one that traveleth, and thy want as an armed man. Keep playing on those computers. Keep watching that television. Keep trying to work with things stuck in your ears constantly. And don't concentrate on your work. Keep that phone plastered to your ear. Talk to all your friends and girlfriends and buddies. Don't pay any attention to your work. And lo and behold, the summer will be over, and the harvest will be past. The opportunity to work will be gone. And you'll show up for work one day, and your employer is going to ask you, what have you been doing the last 2 or 3 years? Well, nothing. Collecting unemployment. There's places to work all over creation. Oh, but those are beneath me. Beneath you? Beneath you? Oh, please say things like that. You'll never get a job Because I'll guarantee you, any job you get will be beneath you, at least in your mind, because you think the gold is not working. Look in Proverbs 13 and verse 4. The soul of the sluggard desireth and hath nothing. Look at all the idiots here. There's a signboard every time I go home out here on 465. Ooh, the lottery. Let's all win the lottery so we don't have to work. Let's all do something so we don't have to do anything. The soul of the sluggard desireth. He wants money. He wants the nice stuff. He wants the $200 shoes. He wants the $1,200 phone. He desireth and hath nothing. He doesn't have a place to live. He's probably been evicted 3 times this year. But the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. And in Proverbs 20 and verse 4, the sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold. And therefore shall he beg and harvest and have nothing. Ooh, it's cold outside. I don't want to work. Oh, it's just blazing hot out there and humid. I would just sweat to death. I'd rather stay here in the air conditioning that my mama provides. Laziness is obvious and has consequences. But notice, you shouldn't work where you're not accomplishing anything. Do you realize that? There are a lot of ways to say that. Don't fish in a dry hole. You know, if you went out to fish and you wormed that hook good and you got your bobber on and you threw it out there in the water and you sat there for 2 or 3 hours, you're an idiot. Or you wanted to really sleep, move that bobber and move that worm somewhere else so you can catch some fish. The Lord said it another way. He said, don't cast your pearls before swine. You know, I've seen people who would get in big arguments with folks. They weren't going to change their mind in the least. It was just an argument for the sake of an argument. And they were going to get a bad reputation for being an arguer. Don't waste your time on that. He said it another way. Don't give that which is holy unto dogs. You know, I've heard preachers who say, well, I can preach, I can walk in a bar and I'll preach. You're in the wrong place. That's the wrong place to be trying to do that. Another way is he used the parable of the sower. Did you learn anything from the parable of the sower? You know, there's all sorts of things to learn there, but you know, there's one basic lesson that was there. You know, you're kind of dumb to be sowing your seed among weeds. You're kind of dumb to be sowing it on the path that's hard as a brick or on the rocks. You're not going to get anything out of that. Sow it in good ground. A lot of people try to preach just for the sake of preaching, instead of thinking about the audience that they're preaching to. Find good people to teach. The Lord said, a prophet is not without honor save in his own country. It may be that your friends that you grew up with have turned into something awful. Why waste your time? They're not going to listen to you. They knew you when you were a kid and all the stupid things you did. But you've changed. You've turned to the Lord. You find people that you can teach that have good hearts and are willing to listen to you. Don't work where you're not accomplishing anything. You know, have you ever seen a guy who had a pump going and pulling out of a pond, and the pump was splashing and just running down the hill back into the pond? What's the point here? At some point, you're not doing anything. Merchandising Merchandising helps. Proverbs 20 and verse 4. You've done this, I know you have. And by the way, if you've ever tried to sell anything, just get ready. You know, you advertise something on Marketplace or Craigslist, or you put a sign out, or you're having a garage sale, and somebody comes up. Did you ever hear somebody come up and say, wow, that thing looks great. I've always wanted one. I'll pay you double whatever you're asking for it. No. They say what Proverbs 20 and verse 14 says. It is not, saith the buyer, but when he is gone his way, then he boasteth. You need to understand a little bit about merchandising. Nobody thinks what you're selling is worth what you're asking for it. That's just the way the game's played. You're going to have to learn what you're doing. Notice this is an interesting point to me in Matthew 10. The Lord said, are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. Now that's a good lesson. We can learn from it. But there was more there. If you look at the companion passage in Luke 12 and verse 6, it says, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Do you see what happened here? 2 sparrows you could buy for 1 farthing. 4 sparrows you could buy for 2 farthings. But this guy knew his merchandising. He threw in an extra sparrow if you would buy more. One was free. Now, the point the Lord's trying to get across to you is that you're worth more than the free sparrow. Free sparrow may have been cheap to the buyer and to the seller, but you're worth more than many sparrows. But the second thing I want you to see is that it matters how you present the issue. You know, you take your car and you want to sell it. What do? Well, first of all, you don't leave the accumulated garbage that's been in it for the last 10 years, all those decaying chicken nuggets that are in the back, and those 15 Cokes you spilled on the carpet. Clean the thing up. Take it to the car wash. Make it look a little better. Now, the same thing applies to you. You looking for a job? You looking to impress somebody? Clean up. Dress up. Dress respectably. Don't go around looking like the dog just chewed you up. Notice again in John 2 and verse 10. Every man in the beginning, this is in the first miracle Jesus performed, and it's a statement made by the host of the feast. You remember Jesus turned the water into wine, and everybody said, this is the best thing we ever tasted. Here's what the master of the feast says. Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine. And when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. Merchandising usually presents the best foot forward. The best wine at the first, the best food. After that, you bring out the bologna. You know, every now and then we have the kids over, and my goodness, these kids, Jonathan, Ethan back there, Nathan, all these kids, Joe and Luke, whew, it's like a forest fire came through the house. They've eaten all the good food my wife prepared, and they're still beginning to look hungrily around. By George, we've still got bologna. We'll fill you up with something. Same thing applies to you in life. You go to apply for a job, you want to look decent, you want to dress, you might shine your shoes just a little bit, comb your hair, Cover up all those tattoos you thought were so neat and everybody would love. Take that piercing out of your nose and try to look decent, will you? Merchandising. Matthew 11 and verse 28, I fully believe this was on a slogan at the Lord's carpenter shop. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. We see that all the time. You see it everywhere. People advertising their cars, people advertising their clothes, people advertising anything. A butterball turkey. All you've got to, it's got the butter in it. And it'll just ooze out if you cook it right. You know, turkeys don't naturally have butterballs. They're not naturally injected with butter. But we do that, and we advertise it. It's advertising. Present yourself well. These are incidental points the Lord made, but it's something you can learn from working. After you've applied for 10 jobs, smelling and looking bad, kind of greasy, you might kind of figure out that maybe the boss is looking for somebody with a little more self-respect. Let me move on. Honesty really is the best policy. Really is. In Luke chapter 6, verse 38, give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye meet, withal it shall be measured to you again. Now that's a simple thing, isn't it? Don't be trying to cheat anybody. If you're going to sell something and there's something wrong with it, go ahead and tell them what's wrong with it. Maybe you won't make as much. But there's no point in cheating everybody. There's just no point in it. It's a bad way to live. It's a bad way to have our society. Now, you might point out the good parts, but you might let them know, hey, the transmission's going to give out in about 2 miles before you get it home. In Mark 4 and verse 24, take heed what ye hear, and with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you. In Matthew 7 and verse 2, with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. With what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Don't be that guy who always thinks everybody's out to cheat him. You know, when you're bargaining with people, when you're talking with them, don't be the one who's always trying to beat him down below his cost. He has to make a living too. Do you want to be dealt with that way yourself? In Romans 12, in verse 17, recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. Now, let's get down a little more practically. Here, sometimes you worry about appearance. You worry about the appearance of a thing. In 2 Corinthians 8, verse 19, Paul was traveling. He was going to be carrying a large amount of money from Greece, Macedonia, other places, back to Jerusalem. But I want you to notice the care he had in that. He says, not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace, which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord and declaration of your ready mind. Avoiding this, that no man should blame us in this abundance, which is administered by us, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. You know, if you're keeping the cash register for your business, you know, a lot of times you want to be real sure that the boss sees you're not dipping in the till. You want to be sure that the balance is right. Now, he may trust you implicitly, but you want to be sure that what you started with, what that cash register says, and what you ended with balances. And it may be that sometimes in dealing with this, where there isn't a balance, that you want somebody there as a witness. I want you to see what I'm doing here. I'm not going to do anything behind the back. I want you to see and know that you can trust me. Honesty is the best policy. 1 Peter 2, verse 12, having your conversation, your manner of life, honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. My wife pointed out to me something the other day. Somebody up on the north side, I don't know who it was, bought a piece of ground, 6 acres, and immediately it was heavily forested. Trees been there for 100 years. The guy immediately went in and clear-cut the thing. Didn't ask for permission, didn't ask anybody, didn't save any of the trees. He just clear-cut it. And the neighbors were outraged. They had, for 100 years, that had been there. Now, granted, he wanted to build and wanted to use it, but he might have gone through some process, zoning process or otherwise, to make sure that was okay. Might have talked to the neighbors just a little bit, seen if he could work that out so that nobody was upset. Provide things honest. I read in the newspaper about him. He said he had a right to do it. It was his property. He had a right to do what he wanted on it. Well, yeah, but we all have neighbors. Maybe you need to provide things a little more honest and even-handed with your neighbors. Do you want your neighbors doing anything on their property right next to you? Suddenly, your property goes down in value because of the piece of junk they put over there? You might think about the reciprocation of that just a little bit. I need to take care of my neighbor. That's really all it is. It's a sort of an honesty. You might notice Titus 2. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their masters and to please them well in all things. Not answering again. Don't be talking back to your boss. But notice, not purloining. Do you know what purloining is? You know, your boss, maybe you're working in a restaurant, maybe you're working in a hardware store. There's all kinds of things there. And it's real hard to keep track of all the chicken nuggets and all the other stuff in that restaurant and all the nuts and bolts, pins, knives, stuff. It's real easy for you to carry home tools, parts. You know, if you're working in retail, really easy to carry home that toaster that nobody's going to notice. It's real easy to carry home food that you don't account for and don't pay for. That's purloining. It's stealing small things that you think nobody will notice. So he says, not purloining, but showing all good fidelity. Why? Well, honesty is the best policy, number one. But number two, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. Why? Jason there? So his boss can say, man, I would trust Jason with anything. I have seen him be precise and meticulous and honest in every dealing I've had with him. Now the boss may say, hey, I don't care if you take home some chicken nuggets. And that stuff you're taking home, no big deal. But you want to be honest about it. In James 5, now listen, you rich men, because now here we go to the other side of this coin. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. You be sure that you're fair and generous with your employees. Be sure of it. The Lord says you'll answer. He says the cries of the harvesters who have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. Colossians 3 and verse 22. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily. Get this. Whatsoever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not unto men. There's another lesson for you kids in school. Whew! Algebra, chemistry, history. We'll work on that here in a minute. But obviously, if you can't work, you can't work. Whatsoever you do, do it heartily. Do the best you can in your classes in school. Do the best you can on your job, not half-hearted, not leaning on your broom, not leaning on your shovel. Do it heartily, as to the Lord, as if you were working for the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. He that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. Now, I added this point. I hope our Spanish translator is keeping up with me. You need to work when you can work. Now, that's an important thing. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, Jesus says. The night cometh when no man can work. Now, there'll be maybe a time that comes in your life when you can't work anymore. When you get too old. When you get too sick. But while you're healthy and strong, you need to prepare. You need to work while you can, while it's day. The night comes when you can't work. The day comes when you can't work. In John 11, verse 9, Jesus said, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not. The night's coming. And in Romans 13:12, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness and put on there, work when you can. That's pretty simple. You know, so many young people think, well, my youth, my 20s, my teens are all for sowing my wild oats. I'll work hard later in my 40s and 50s, and then I'll retire. Well, you know, the time may not be there. You better work while you can work. You need to learn to make an investment. The Lord talks about that. You've heard the expression, or your mama should have told you, it takes money to make money. You're going to have to mass up a little pile of money to make an investment. The Lord said, He which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. You know, if you don't make much investment, you're not going to get much back. I don't know what kind of investments you've seen, but go down to the bank and tell them you want to open a savings account. They're going to pay you less than 0.5%. In fact, 0.5% would be generous on that savings account. You might think of other ways to make an investment. You know, the Lord told the man, the one-talent man said, why didn't you take what I gave you to the bankers, and you'd get something back for the money I gave you? Now, the same thing applies to you. You better amass up and make an investment. It may be your labor, it may be your sweat, it may be your house, it may be a lot of things, but make an investment so that you can, it'll pay off later. In Galatians 6, Be not deceived, God's not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. There's that same principle. Make an investment. You're going to one way or the other, in poverty or in wealth. You might also notice Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 1. Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. It's talking about growing rice. Rice is grown in muddy ground. Cast it out there in the water and the mud. It'll grow. But if you don't put it out in the spring, when it's cold, when it's wet, when it's icky, you're not going to harvest anything. In Proverbs 31, it praises the wife, the good wife. She's like the merchant ships. She bringeth her food from afar. In Matthew 13, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a treasure hid in the field, the which when a man hath found he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. You know, at some point in your life, if you've helped yourself and massed up a little bit, good credit at least, an opportunity is going to present itself. And it's not going to stay open. It's not going to be available long. Are you going to be able to take advantage of it? In Matthew 13 again, verse 45 through 46, kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchant man seeking goodly pearls, who when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. You need to make some investment in life. And this spiritually pertains as well. Generosity, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, is part of the equation. We talked about gleaning in our previous lesson, that it's important that you allow people to survive off of you. In James 2 and verse 5, if a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? You might, since I just thought of this passage, you might look with me over in Ephesians. This must be one of those ready recollections. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Yeah. In verse 28 of Ephesians 4, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands, the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Generosity is part of this equation that you need to learn. The Lord was talking about that. He says in Matthew 5, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. He says in Luke 12 through 14, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, and you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now then, another thing the Lord talked about was the simple idea of inheritance. And you might remember this too. I know we talk about jokes. I think Dick Green had a bumper sticker, not a bumper, a license plate on his car. Something about he was spending his children's inheritance. I think he was joking. I suspect he was. Because the Lord says, now I am ready to visit you for the third time, and I'll not be a burden to you. Because what I want is not your possessions, but you. After all, children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. You need to lay by for your kids and leave something to your family after you. Don't try to spend it all. The whole objective of life is not to die penniless, but to leave something for your family Didn't you read the story of the prodigal son? Not once did the father in Luke 15 resent giving to his children. The elder son, all that I have is yours. The younger son said, give me my portion. And he wasted it, blew it. That's shameful. But that's not the point we're talking about right now. The point was, lay by for your family. Lay by for your children. It's not all about you. It's about the world that's be after you. And remember, final point, you've been waiting for this one. Remember, we do all this labor for the glory of God. In Colossians 3 and verse 17, whatever you do in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. That work you're doing at school, that work you're doing there at the factory, that work you're doing driving that truck, that work you're doing in that office setting. You need to remember you're really working for the Lord. You're leaving an example for Him. In Colossians 3 and verse 22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you'll receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, for there is no favoritism. Same point he makes in Ephesians 6 and verse 5. You might also notice 1 Timothy 6 and verse 1. Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those worthless Christians, you can't trust them anywhere. You don't want your boss saying that. I've heard about those folks in that Church of Christ. Bunch of hypocrites. You should have heard the way Bill talked down at work. You should have seen the lousy work ethic that he had. Those who are believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who are benefited by their good service are believers and beloved. Teach and urge these things. In Titus 2, bondservants are to be submissive to their own masters in everything. They're to be well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, but showing all good faith, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior. In 1 Peter 2, verse 18, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, also to the unjust. This is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Can you learn this lesson from working? My boss treated me bad. I've heard that so many times from foolish young people. It is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Do you realize Jesus Christ endured unjustly on this earth in your behalf, and you're not worthy to put up with a little bit of hassle from your boss? For what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow His steps. Jesus, for 30 years, was a carpenter. He learned to work. He observed workmen all around him. And there are a million more lessons I could have stuck in this sermon. He used them. He learned from them. Don't let your mind go blank when you work. Learn the lessons. See them. They'll be there every day. Whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord. Now, quite simply, for you, the night's far spent. The day is at hand. You need to obey the gospel. Come while we stand and sing.